Mr Speaker.
For the Honourable Pete Hodson.
Mr Speaker, I'm sorry that the National Party is not choosing to contribute to the debate on a piece of legislation which matters. I wonder if the member for Social Development would like to pull in what is left of her head, and I'll continue with my contribution to the House. Madam Speaker, Mr Speaker, I do think that the National Party should contribute to the legislation, and the fact that they're doing what's called whips calls, which means they get up, say something and sit down, and therefore count as having made a speech, and therefore count as having made 1/12 of the way through to the end point of the legislation, is not a very good look. The Labor Party will be supporting this legislation. We do so with some mixture of views and with some hesitation. And a mixture of views and hesitation always attends legislation of this ilk. It always attends this legislation of this ilk, because legislation of this ilk, as people who understand it far better than I will indicate, seeks to achieve a balance between protection of society on the one hand from bad people and attention to human rights on the other side from an excitable state sector. And our position on the legislation is that getting that balance right is going to take a bit of time. And over the years, the one thing that has, I think, has been an increase in the degree of transparency that applies to SIS activities and SIS legislation. So, for example, there used to be no ability to examine the SIS at a select committee level. There was no ability to do that. There was an obligation on the SIS to tell the Prime Minister of the day how many people's phones had been tapped. The Prime Minister of the day would put that number on the floor of the House once a year, and that was that. And these days we have more openness than that. In other words, the SIS have got certain powers that no one else has, but are obliged to explain what they do with them more openly than they ever have before. And so one of the things that society can do is it's trying to match this balance between what is perceived to be the need for closer public safety or more attention to public security on the one hand and attention to human rights on the other, is to reach for transparency. And there are various ways of doing so. Of course, things can go wrong. I can remember being a member of the Cabinet during the Ahmed Zawi case. That was a very difficult time to be in government because the law couldn't be changed midstream. We did, however, indicate that we would change it at the end of the course of that process, and we did. But it's an example of what can happen when things go wrong and people decide that a person has got a certain profile which it turns out that they may not have. And Keith Locke, who's sitting not so far away from me now, is another example of someone who, perhaps somewhat to his considerable surprise, has been under the watch of the SIS because he's such a beastly terrorist-inspired sort of a coot. And he's found himself, until recent times, under the examination of the spooks. And that is simply bizarre. So when it comes to the select committee hearings for this legislation, the idea that they would be all held in secret is itself intolerable. And the way that the select committee is put together, as I understand it, is that any one person on the select committee can veto the hearing of evidence in public. In other words, the rules around it are tilted such that you need unanimity to get openness. And any one person can require things to be closed. I think I have got that right. I think I saw the Prime Minister of the land, who was a member of the Select Committee, tell the House that the day before yesterday, or it may have even been yesterday, that he was of the view that things would need to be held in secret. Therefore, because he alone held that view, they would be held in secret. Now, we're learning today that maybe the Prime Minister is changing his mind. But I would simply say to the Prime Minister that it is not okay to be beholden to the wisdom, or at least the advice, of SIS folk, who of course are going to say we want to be heard in secret. Of course they're going to say we don't want any hearings to be made public. Of course are going to not want transparency on their watch, because that's not their style, it's not their history, it's not where they've come from, it's why they're called spooks. But that doesn't make it good. And I think that if we're to have the SIS getting into the Prime Minister's ear, getting him excited, giving him sort of boys' own manual stuff about how we really shouldn't allow the bright lights of transparency to shine on the processes of this legislation, and that Prime Minister uses his veto right to ensure that the rest of the country doesn't get to see what goes on in the Select Committee, that's bad style. That is bad style. And we do know that the Prime Minister is subject to that sort of boys' own excitable story stuff, because he travels with an enormous number of Diplomatic Protection Squad personnel around him. He's got people striding around, even walking into this chamber. He comes with an armed guard. I mean, it's unbelievable. I don't know of any Prime Minister in the history of this country, there's certainly none that I've had anything to do with, who walk around this building with armed guards, with lumpy armpits, either side. Who is going to trammel on the dignity of the Prime Minister in this place? I really do think that he is sort of vulnerable to that excitable boys' own stuff. And I think that that's a shame, because if the Prime Minister is of that nature, if that is his personality, then maybe it has affected his approach to the openness of the Select Committee hearings. And if that's the case, then we do have a situation where one person alone gets to say that the rest of the 4 million of us are not entitled to have an open process for this legislation. That's not good. The ideal would be to have a default position which was open except, that there will be some instances at some stage where the Select Committee members should be the only ones to know some level of evidence. I can imagine that being the case. And I would be comfortable with that, even though I'm not myself on the Select Committee. But the default position has to be, let's have it in the open unless. And at the moment, the default position, occasioned by the Prime Minister alone, seems to be, let's have it all locked up, unless I change my mind. Well, I'm saying to the Prime Minister, change your mind. Please change your mind, because you're about to make a big mistake if you don't. It is really important, as we try and balance, on the one hand, the dignity and importance of human rights, and on the other hand, the protection of society, that we use transparency as a way to get that balance right. And the Prime Minister is of an opposite view.